I'm going to start just with a little bit of introduction. There is a difference between costing and price. The cost of something and the value of something, the price of something. A cost is what it costs you, and a price is what it costs them, whoever the client is. As we've heard in previous sessions, Felix describes costing as a science and pricing as an art. You can think to some extent of costing being objective and pricing being subjective, or costing being about absolutes and something that's measurable, whereas pricing can be about marketing and alchemy almost. It's so the cost of you might have significantly higher prices than your costs as part of your brand, as part of your marketing. So that's one of the things that we talk about. Now, this isn't in itself, this is an extreme version. So there's definitely subjectivity in costing. There's definitely objectivity in pricing. Both of these areas need judgment. And we're going to be talking a lot about costing today, but we're also going to be talking about pricing. We're going to cover both. And I hope it makes sense. If you're not sure, just raise your hand and ask a question. And we're also going to be talking about grants and tenders. The first webinar was on project design. The second webinar was on fundraising through grants. The third webinar was on tenders that Felix led last week. We're now trying to make pricing relevant to both. In a grant, you have a known total amount. The donor will say you can apply for up to, say, $50,000. They may specify, or you may want to put in indirect costs. In most grants, the person who pays is not the person who receives the benefit. The payer is not the customer. Because of that, you have monitoring and evaluation, you have reporting, you have all sorts of methods to show that you're using the money wisely. And it is fundamentally the fact that the payer is not the customer. The person who pays is not the person who receives. That leads to all of that work on accountability. In a grant, you might have a grant agreement. You might have fund managers. So you might have intermediaries between where the money is coming from originally and the organization that you deal with. So in the case of this project, the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project, the fund manager is called Research and Innovation Systems in Africa. That's the fund. It is managed by Comonix, but the money is from the UK government. So it's been designed and is the client, the payer is the UK government, but the funds are being managed by intermediaries, and it's the intermediaries that we in our team here deal with. In grants, you use their contract. And it's very hard often to change that contract, though negotiation is always recommended. And in grants, the project is often the most important thing. The design of the project is the most important thing, not necessarily the price, because you have a known total. So it's what can you, how effective can you be? That's not how many people you can help, the biggest numbers or whatever, but it's how effective you can be for that known total. In tenders, you don't necessarily know what the total is. And we've got a section later on, as I said, on understanding the market and understanding the client. You might not have indirect costs, but you might think of it as a profit margin. In most tenders, the person who pays is the customer, and there's direct accountability there. Often in a tender, because the person who pays is the customer, they don't want to necessarily see your books. They don't necessarily want to see your finances, unlike with a grant. In a tender, you might be using your contract, not theirs. So you have to have the one that produces the contract and produces the invoices, not, you don't have to accept someone else's contract, potentially, most of the time. You have that direct relationship with the customer. There are no intermediaries to worry about. And price is often key. You hear a lot that tenders tend to go to the ones who are cheapest. That, particularly in public sector procurement, they care, the biggest weighting on the assessment is on price. And that isn't always the case. Again, it's about knowing your client, knowing your market, but it is one of those things that you have to keep an eye on. Anna, Felix, any comments on this, please, in terms of framing the workshop?
Yeah, I just want to tie two thoughts that will come up later in terms of like contract and grants and tenders, for instance. In what I'll speak to later, with part of the contract or your terms and conditions, who sets the terms and conditions under which you are prepared to work.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, and that's / contract. Where do you draw the line in what you are prepared to do for the price that you are charging? And that's linked to the contract. But those sort of terms or conditions, when you actually, sometimes you are the one setting them, sometimes you receive them.
Absolutely. Anna, any comments on these distinctions I've been drawing between costing and pricing? Or thank you, Anna. Okay. They have things in common. You have to understand the market, you have to understand the client. With both grants and tenders, you have to be careful about cash flow. You really have to be careful about cash flow. You have to think about matched funds. I can get into that a little bit more, but that's always a question mark. And in the case of grants, it might just say you need to put in 25% of the cost yourself. Or in terms of tenders, what you might find is that you have multiple clients wanting the same product, or more or less the same time. So there is some commonality there in terms of the way of thinking about it. There's also a lot of sweat equity involved now with that's essentially the cost of bidding, the opportunity cost. But it might also be that you have to go above and beyond what you're used to doing in some way. So you put in money, you put in cost for free, essentially, in order to win the bid. The opportunity costs are similar in that sense. Both are subject to currency changes. Both come with risks. I've had governments cancel contracts on me before, midway through a project. Usually they do pay up, but that isn't always the case with some clients, and we've got some nightmare stories just to cheer you up at the end of the webinar. Most of the time, both of these groups might ask you for, could you do something extra for us? So, for example, in the Innovative Manufacturing in Africa project, we wrote the budget, we put the application together, we submitted it. They turned around and said, great, all done. But would you mind spending 3 days at this workshop in Nairobi, please? We need you to participate in the pause and reflect sessions. And I said, well, yes, but this is going to cost us and it's not in the budget. So they paid us an extra amount, about 2,500 it was, to get people to travel to Nairobi to cover their travel costs and their time. So sometimes there's additional work that gets paid for, but there's also, in both cases, both grants and tenders, additional work that they don't necessarily pay for. And in a classic example of this is, the minister is coming. Can you put on a nice display? Or we're doing a press release. Could you spend some time writing a story to put into the press release? And there's all sorts of examples that I'm sure we could talk about when it comes to tenders. But there's often additional things that the person who's paying you might ask for in both of these cases.